The world thought World War II would bring peace. Cities were in ruins, millions were dead, and humanity hoped, begged, for calm. But instead of peace, a new kind of war began. A war without armies facing each other on open battlefields. A war without declarations. A war fought with fear, spies, nukes, propaganda. And silence. This was the birth of the Cold War. When Nazi Germany fell in 1945, two nations emerged as superpowers. The United States, rich, industrial, victorious, standing on the ideals of democracy. The Soviet Union, powerful, vast, hardened by suffering, and determined to spread communism. They were allies against Hitler. But the moment the war ended, the real tension began. Globe showing Europe-Africa, the world split in two. Europe was broken, literally and politically. The US wanted free elections and open markets. The USSR wanted control, security, and communist governments in its border states. Winston Churchill would later describe it perfectly. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Countries like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia fell under Soviet influence. Meanwhile, Britain and America held control over Western Europe. The planet was now divided into two ideologies. Blue Circle capitalism and democracy, led by the US. Red Circle communism and state control, led by the Soviet Union. And both sides believed the other would destroy the world. Warning why it was called Cold. Because this war was not fought with guns. It was fought with propaganda, espionage, psychological warfare, nuclear threats, economic pressure, proxy wars, space competition. No direct battle. Just constant tension, enough to freeze the world with fear. That's why it was called the Cold War. Bomb the seeds of distrust. During World War II, the US secretly developed a terrifying weapon. The atomic bomb. They did not tell the Soviets until the bomb was already dropped on Japan. Joseph Stalin felt betrayed. He believed America intended to dominate the world through nuclear intimidation. From that moment, Russia began racing to create its own bomb. The world entered an era where one mistake could end humanity. United States, the Truman Doctrine. In 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman announced something that would define global politics for decades. The United States will support any nation threatened by communism. This meant, if the USSR tried to expand, America would push back, hard. This was not a political statement. It was a declaration of global responsibility, and global confrontation. Dollar banknote Marshall Plan, the economic weapon. The US poured billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. They weren't just helping. They were pulling nations firmly into their economic and political orbit. The Soviets saw this as a threat. They blocked all American influence in Eastern Europe and created their own economic programs. The world economy itself became a battlefield. Germany, the flashpoint. Germany had surrendered, but it was split into 4 zones controlled by the US, Britain, France, the Soviet Union. Berlin, deep inside Soviet territory, was also divided. This single city would become the symbol of Cold War tension. A symbol of what happens when two superpowers try to control the same space. Within just 2 years, everything was ready. The distrust. The political clashes. The nuclear tension. The divided world. The stage was set. The Cold War had begun. Coming up next, the Berlin blockade, the moment the Cold War almost turned hot. By 1948, Europe was still a continent struggling to recover from the devastation of World War II. But another battle was brewing, this time not with guns, but with politics, economics, and sheer survival. Germany, the nation at the heart of Europe, had been split into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, Germany's capital, though located deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided among the 4 powers. It was a city under tension, a city where the world could witness the first real flashpoint of the Cold War. The Soviets were deeply suspicious of the US and Britain. They viewed the Marshall Plan, America's economic aid program, as a threat to their influence in Europe. When the Western Allies announced plans to introduce a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in West Berlin, Stalin saw red. To him, this was more than economic reform. It was an attempt to undermine Soviet control in the East. He decided to take drastic action. On June 24, 1948, the Soviets imposed the Berlin blockade. All rail, road, and water access to West Berlin was cut off. Fuel, food, medicine, everything necessary for survival, was blocked. 2 million Berliners were trapped behind enemy lines, facing starvation and despair. The world held its breath. But the West was not about to surrender. The United States and Britain launched an unprecedented operation, the Berlin Airlift. Cargo planes flew day and night, landing at Tempelhof and Gatow airports with supplies to feed the city. Planes delivered food, coal, and medicine, sometimes landing every few minutes, creating one of the largest humanitarian air operations in history. The blockade lasted 11 months, testing the resolve of both superpowers. Stalin, expecting the West to buckle, underestimated the determination and ingenuity of the Allies. The airlift became a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the ideological divide that now defined the world. Every plane that landed was more than just cargo. It carried the message that democracy and freedom would not yield to fear. It was also a warning: the Cold War had entered a new stage. No longer a war of words and propaganda, it was a war of survival, strategy, and endurance. At the same time, the blockade hardened the division of Germany. By 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was officially created, aligned with the West. The German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was formed under Soviet influence. Berlin remained divided, a small city in the center of Europe symbolizing a world split in two. Magnifying glass tilted left the first signs of escalation. The Berlin blockade also showcased the role of technology, logistics, and intelligence in this silent war. The West relied on radar, air traffic coordination, and supply chain expertise to sustain the airlift. The Soviets observed, adapted, and tested the limits of Allied response. This was Cold War strategy in its purest form, a battle of nerves, not bullets. One miscalculation could have escalated into nuclear conflict. Leaders on both sides knew the world was now living under the shadow of atomic weapons. Globe with Meridian's global impact. The Berlin blockade was more than a European crisis. It was a warning to the world: the Cold War would not remain in isolated corners. It would shape global alliances, military strategies, and political decisions for decades. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, would soon be formed in response, a military alliance meant to contain Soviet expansion. Meanwhile, the Warsaw Pact would emerge as the Soviet countermeasure. The tension, fear, and political maneuvering in Berlin set the pattern for the next 40 years of global standoff. The blockade ended on May 12, 1949, when the Soviets finally lifted restrictions. But the world had changed. The Cold War had proven it could escalate quickly, disrupt lives, and test the limits of human endurance. Berlin became the stage on which the first act of this silent war was performed, and its lessons would echo in conflicts around the globe for decades. What happens when superpowers collide on distant soil? The answer will shock you. While the world had just witnessed the tense standoff in Berlin, another crisis erupted thousands of miles away, this time in Asia. The Cold War was no longer just a European struggle, it had gone global. The Korean Peninsula, a land divided by history and foreign influence, became the first true battlefield of the Cold War. In 1945, Korea had been liberated from Japanese occupation at the end of World War II. But the peninsula was immediately split at the 38th parallel. The north occupied by Soviet forces, adopting communism under Kim Il-sung. The south influenced by the United States, led by Syngman Rhee, embracing democracy. Initially, this division was intended as temporary. But distrust, ideological differences, and geopolitical ambitions turned it into a permanent fracture. Fire the invasion that changed everything. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel, invading the south with overwhelming force. Seoul, the South's capital, fell within days. The world watched as communist forces advanced, seemingly unstoppable. The United Nations quickly responded, led by the United States under President Harry Truman. This was not just a conflict between Koreans, it had become a proxy war, a direct reflection of the global Cold War struggle. American forces, supported by troops from other UN nations, fought desperately to halt the communist advance. The battle lines shifted rapidly. Cities were captured and recaptured. In Pusan, the South's forces held a desperate perimeter, their backs against the sea. This was a fight for survival, not just for territory, but for ideology itself. High voltage the Incheon landing, turning the tide. In September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched one of history's most audacious amphibious assaults at Incheon. It was risky, landing behind enemy lines, in a city surrounded by tides and cliffs, but it worked. North Korean forces were thrown into chaos. Seoul was liberated. A stalemate emerges. By 1953, after 3 brutal years of fighting, the war ended in a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. The 38th parallel remained the dividing line, solidifying the demilitarized zone, DMZ, one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. The Korean War left scars. Millions of dead and wounded. Cities in ruins. Families torn apart. The world more aware than ever of the Cold War's deadly stakes. The conflict was a stark reminder, the Cold War had turned violent, and the fight between democracy and communism was no longer a distant threat. It had arrived in the lives of ordinary people, changing history in real time. As Korea burned, the superpowers looked to new arenas for influence, including a race that would take humanity beyond Earth itself. By the late 1950s, the Cold War had transformed from a tense political standoff into a global competition for technological, military, and ideological supremacy. Europe had been divided, Asia was in flames, and now the battleground extended far beyond Earth itself, into the cosmos. The space race was born, a thrilling contest that combined ambition, science, and national pride. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with rockets, satellites, and human courage. The spark, Sputnik. The world changed forever on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. For the Soviets, it was a triumph, a demonstration of scientific ingenuity, industrial power, and global influence. For the United States, it was a shock. America realized that the Soviets now had the capability to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. If they could put a satellite into orbit, they could send nuclear weapons across the globe. Panic and urgency swept through the U.S. government, universities, and military institutions. The Cold War had now entered space, and the stakes were higher than ever. America responds, the birth of NASA. In 1958, the United States responded decisively by establishing NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. A new generation of scientists, engineers, and astronauts embarked on a mission to catch up and surpass the Soviet Union. This was not just science, it was geopolitics. The space race became a way to demonstrate technological superiority, political ideology, and national prestige to the entire world. Key milestones and tensions. Over the next decade, the space race was defined by a series of dramatic, often dangerous milestones. Sputnik 2, 1957 carried Laika, the first living creature to orbit Earth, marking humanity's first step into extraterrestrial life experiments. Explorer 1, 1958 America's first satellite, proving the U.S. could compete in space technology. Luna 2, 1959 the Soviet spacecraft that became the first human-made object to reach the Moon's surface. Mercury program, 1961 to 1963 America's first human spaceflight program, producing astronauts like John Glenn, the first American to orbit Earth. Every success by one side intensified pressure on the other. Propaganda, media coverage, and political rhetoric transformed each launch into a global spectacle, a demonstration of ideological might. The space race was no longer just science, it was a symbolic battlefield of the Cold War. The Moon as a Cold War stage. The stakes reached their peak in the 1960s with President John F. Kennedy's famous declaration. "We choose to go to the Moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." The Apollo program became a national mission, an attempt to prove America's superiority in technology, strategy, and human ingenuity. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pushed its own ambitious lunar programs, testing rockets and unmanned spacecraft with meticulous precision. Every launch, every failure, and every success was a reminder, the Cold War had expanded beyond Earth, and its battles now had cosmic implications. Global impact. The space race influenced more than just science. It affected education, a surge in STEM programs worldwide. Military strategy, satellites and space-based surveillance became critical. International politics, nations aligned themselves symbolically with one superpower or another. Culture, space became a metaphor for human ambition and ideological struggle. It was a new kind of war, one fought in the silence of orbit, yet with consequences that could shake the world. Legacy of the space race. By the end of the 1960s, the Apollo 11 mission achieved the ultimate victory, humans walked on the Moon. America had claimed the stars first, but the Soviets had achieved firsts in nearly every other space milestone. The space race demonstrated the tangible power of technological competition in the Cold War. It was a race of minds, courage, and willpower, a silent yet fiercely global battlefield. And while rockets soared and astronauts orbited Earth, the ideological war on the ground continued. Berlin remained divided. Vietnam loomed. And nuclear weapons threatened humanity from hidden silos across the globe. The Cold War had gone cosmic, but the stakes were still very much human. While humanity reached for the stars, a more deadly battlefield awaited below, Vietnam. On the ground, it was tearing nations apart, forcing ordinary people into the crossfire of a global struggle they did not start. Nowhere was this clearer than in Vietnam. A divided nation. Vietnam, a country in Southeast Asia, had been under French colonial rule for decades. After World War II, Vietnamese nationalists, led by Ho Chi Minh, fought for independence. In 1954, France withdrew after its defeat at Dien Bien Phu, leaving Vietnam divided at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam, communist, backed by the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam, anti-communist, supported by the United States. This division made Vietnam a proxy battleground in the larger Cold War. What began as a nationalist struggle quickly became a global conflict of ideologies. The U.S. escalates. The United States, determined to contain communism under the domino theory, sent advisors, funding, and eventually combat troops to South Vietnam. By 1965, America had fully committed to a war it believed was vital to preserving democracy in Asia. The Viet Cong, communist guerrillas operating in the South, were cunning and relentless. They knew the terrain, the people, and the strategies of their enemy. Jungles, rivers, and mountains became battlegrounds of ambush, traps, and hidden tunnels. Guerrilla warfare and human cost. The Vietnam War introduced a brutal form of warfare to the Cold War: guerrilla tactics, chemical weapons, and heavy aerial bombardment. Dense jungles concealed Viet Cong tunnels, allowing surprise attacks on U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. The U.S. deployed Agent Orange, a defoliant meant to destroy vegetation but leaving devastating effects on civilians and soldiers alike. Cities and villages were caught in the crossfire, forcing millions of Vietnamese to flee or live in constant fear. The war was not only military, it was psychological. American soldiers faced ambushes, booby traps, and the constant threat of invisible enemies. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese propaganda emphasized resistance and national unity, keeping morale high despite heavy casualties. Global implications. Vietnam became the quintessential proxy war of the Cold War. It demonstrated that the conflict between the U.S. and USSR could manifest in local wars thousands of miles away. Weapons, advisors, and money flowed in from both superpowers, escalating a conflict that was, at its core, a Vietnamese struggle for independence. Media coverage brought the war into homes across the globe. Television broadcasted graphic images of death and destruction, sparking anti-war movements and political debates in the United States and Europe. The Vietnam War showed that the Cold War was no longer a distant standoff, it was a war that affected everyone, both directly and indirectly. Turning points. One of the pivotal moments came during the Tet Offensive in 1968. The Viet Cong launched coordinated attacks on over 100 South Vietnamese cities. Although militarily it was a defeat for the Communists, it was a psychological victory, shocking the American public and undermining confidence in U.S. leadership. The war dragged on for years, costing millions of lives. For Americans, it became a symbol of Cold War limits and the dangers of ideological obsession. For the Vietnamese, it was a struggle for survival, sovereignty, and self-determination. Lessons from Vietnam. By the mid-1970s, the United States withdrew, leaving the war unresolved for years. Vietnam eventually unified under communist rule, proving that ideology alone could not guarantee victory. The Vietnam War highlighted a critical lesson of the Cold War. Global ideological struggles often had local consequences, and superpower involvement could amplify human suffering. It was a conflict where the battlefield extended from jungles to cities, from political offices to living rooms worldwide, reminding the world that the Cold War was not only a war of spies, rockets, and propaganda, but also a war of people, places, and lives. As the jungles of Vietnam simmered, the Cold War moved into new arenas: covert operations, intelligence wars, and nuclear brinkmanship. While battles raged in jungles and rockets soared into space, the Cold War had another, darker front, a war of shadows, invisible to most of the world but as deadly as any battlefield. This was the realm of espionage, covert operations, and intelligence warfare, a world where secrets could change the course of nations. The rise of the spy. After World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union realized that information was as powerful as firepower. Governments poured billions into intelligence agencies. The CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, in the United States. The KGB, Committee for State Security, in the Soviet Union. These agencies were tasked with gathering information, influencing politics, and eliminating threats, all in secret. The Cold War was not only fought in jungles, skies, and space, it was fought in shadows, boardrooms, and back alleys. Covert operations across the globe. The CIA and KGB operated across continents, from Latin America to Africa, Asia to Europe, shaping events without firing a shot in the open. Iran, 1953, the CIA orchestrated a coup to overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, restoring the Shah to power and protecting American oil interests. Guatemala, 1954, another covert CIA operation removed President Jacobo Arbenz, accused of communist sympathies, plunging the country into decades of instability. Hungary, 1956, Soviet forces crushed a revolution against communism, while Western intelligence quietly monitored and reported on the unfolding crisis. These operations were calculated, clandestine, and often morally ambiguous. The goal was clear: maintain global influence without triggering nuclear war, but the human cost was immense. Double agents and spy networks. Espionage thrived on deception. Double agents, secret codes, and hidden cameras became essential weapons. Famous spies of the era included Aldrich Ames, who infiltrated the CIA for the KGB. The Cambridge Five, British spies passing secrets to Moscow. Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet officer feeding intelligence to the West. Each revelation of betrayal heightened mistrust, forcing governments to operate in constant paranoia. Alliances were fragile, no one could fully trust even their closest partners. Technology and the intelligence race. Just as rockets and satellites defined the space race, technology became the backbone of espionage. High-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, like the U-2, flew deep into enemy territory to capture aerial photographs. Satellites monitored missile silos and troop movements. Encryption and code-breaking became essential to protect secrets and intercept enemy communications. Every intercepted message, every bug planted in an embassy, every piece of intelligence could tip the balance of power. A single misstep could provoke retaliation, international scandal, or even war. Global implications. The intelligence war transformed international relations. World leaders relied on spies to make decisions, often in secrecy from their own citizens. Democracies and dictatorships alike were vulnerable to infiltration, blackmail, and misinformation. The Cold War's shadow battles affected every corner of the globe. From Europe to Latin America, Africa to Asia, espionage shaped coups, revolutions, and political strategies. The world was engaged in a war without borders, a silent conflict with consequences as real as any battlefield. Legacy of the Shadow War. By the 1970s and 1980s, intelligence agencies had become permanent pillars of global power. Spy novels, films, and media dramatized the intrigue, but the reality was far more dangerous. Assassinations and covert sabotage. Political destabilization. Global surveillance networks. Nuclear secrets. The Shadow War proved that the Cold War was not always visible, but it was always present. While ordinary citizens went about their lives, leaders and spies waged a battle that could decide the fate of millions. While spies moved in the shadows, the nuclear threat grew brighter than ever. By the early 1960s, the Cold War had become a high-stakes chess game with the entire world as its board. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer just competing in politics, ideology, or space, they were competing with nuclear weapons capable of annihilating humanity. The tension reached its peak in October 1962, during one of the most dangerous moments in human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. A tiny island, a global threat. Cuba, only 90 miles from the U.S. coast, had been transformed under Fidel Castro into a communist ally of the Soviet Union. The United States, fearing the spread of communism so close to home, had already attempted the Bay of Pigs invasion, which ended in humiliation for Washington. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity: station nuclear missiles in Cuba. The missiles would be capable of striking nearly every major U.S. city within minutes. For the first time, the Cold War had brought the world within minutes of total annihilation. Discovery and panic. On October 14, 1962, American U-2 reconnaissance planes captured photographic evidence of Soviet missile installations under construction in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy was informed. For the next 13 days, the world held its breath. Leaders of both superpowers faced a nightmare scenario: one misstep could trigger nuclear war, potentially ending civilization. The U.S. imposed a naval blockade, euphemistically called a quarantine, around Cuba to prevent further missiles from arriving. Tensions soared as Soviet ships approached the blockade, and the possibility of armed confrontation loomed. Negotiation on the edge. Behind closed doors, Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in tense diplomacy. Letters were exchanged. Back-channel messages carried threats and promises. Both sides understood that escalation could mean global catastrophe. The world watched silently. People in New York, Moscow, and Havana went about their daily lives, unaware that nuclear war could erupt at any moment. After intense negotiations, a deal was reached. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba. The United States secretly promised to remove missiles from Turkey and pledged not to invade Cuba. The crisis ended, but the fear lingered. For the first time, humanity had seen just how close it was to nuclear destruction. Global implications. The Cuban Missile Crisis reshaped Cold War strategy. Communication channels were established to prevent accidental escalation, the hotline between Washington and Moscow. Both superpowers realized the immense risk of direct confrontation. Nuclear strategy evolved to include deterrence, mutually assured destruction, MAD, and careful diplomacy. The crisis proved that ideology alone could no longer justify reckless brinkmanship. The world had glimpsed the terrifying potential of the Cold War, and understood that human survival was at stake. Lessons learned. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated the power of restraint, intelligence, and negotiation. It also highlighted the importance of trust, even between enemies. While the Cold War would continue for decades, the crisis became a turning point, a reminder that the stakes of this silent war were not only political or ideological but existential. For ordinary people, the crisis was invisible but omnipresent. Families huddled in fallout shelters, schools conducted drills, and the global population faced a shared, unspoken fear, the nuclear shadow of the Cold War. After surviving the brink of nuclear war, the world watched as the Cold War entered its final decade of tension and transformation. By the 1980s, the Cold War had stretched across 4 decades, shaping the world's politics, technology, and societies. But the icy standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union was beginning to thaw, not through battle, but through political, economic, and social forces. The Soviet Union in crisis. The USSR faced mounting internal challenges. A stagnant economy, burdened by military spending and inefficient planning. Political corruption and declining public faith in the Communist Party. A rising desire for freedom among the Eastern Bloc nations. Mikhail Gorbachev, becoming the Soviet leader in 1985, introduced reforms. Glasnost, openness allowing more transparency, freedom of speech, and political discussion. Perestroika, restructuring attempting to modernize the economy and reduce inefficiency. These reforms were designed to save the USSR, but they accelerated its collapse, sparking movements for independence in various republics and satellite states. The fall of the Berlin Wall. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of the Cold War's end was the Berlin Wall. Erected in 1961, the wall had divided East and West Berlin for nearly 3 decades, a stark reminder of the world's ideological divide. But by 1989, mass protests, economic pressures, and political reform movements in East Germany made the wall unsustainable. On November 9, 1989, the world watched in awe as East German officials announced the border was open. Thousands of people surged across, chipping away at the concrete barrier, reuniting families, and celebrating freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than a physical event, it was a powerful symbol that the Cold War's rigid divisions were crumbling. The dissolution of the USSR. The collapse of the Berlin Wall was followed by rapid change across Eastern Europe. Communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria fell. Nationalist movements surged across the USSR's republics. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. 15 independent republics emerged, including Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. The Cold War, once a global standoff between 2 superpowers, had ended peacefully, without the catastrophic nuclear war that many had feared. The end of the Cold War reshaped the world. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, guiding global politics and economics. Former communist nations transitioned to democracy and market economies, with varying degrees of success. NATO and former Warsaw Pact nations redefined alliances and security strategies. The collapse also left lessons about the limits of ideology, the costs of military standoffs, and the power of people-driven reform movements. Legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War left a lasting imprint on global history. Technological innovation, satellites, nuclear energy, and space exploration were accelerated. Military strategies and intelligence networks still influence modern defense and espionage. Global diplomacy lessons, crisis management, negotiation, and nuclear deterrence became essential tools. Cultural and ideological influence, the Cold War shaped art, literature, and media for decades. Above all, it reminds the world that ideology can divide, but dialogue and reform can unite. The Berlin Wall may have fallen, the USSR may have dissolved, but the echoes of the Cold War continue to shape our political, technological, and cultural landscape today. The Cold War was a battle without traditional war zones, a struggle defined by ideology, technology, espionage, and diplomacy. It spanned continents and even reached beyond our planet, influencing generations and leaving legacies still felt in today's global order. From Berlin to Vietnam, from space to secret intelligence operations, and to the brink of nuclear disaster in Cuba, the Cold War shaped the 20th century. Its end was not sudden, but inevitable, a testament to resilience, reform, and the enduring human desire for freedom.